things that we're going to be kind of reviewing here in this section 4.3. One of them is right triangle trig, which this right triangle trig piece, oops, sorry, didn't mean to move it. Back. What we mean by right triangle trig is those are the things like sine, cosine, tangent, and do you remember the other three you learned in algebra 2? Cosecant, secant, cotangent. Very good. Cosecant, secant, and cotangent. Okay, so those are your right triangle trigs. You know, like you might be given an angle and then you can evaluate it with a calculator, or you might be given a triangle so you can just do the ratio SOHCAHTOA style. Special right triangles, the second part that you're going to be reviewing today, I mentioned those yesterday. There are two special right triangles, right? 30, 60, 90, and 45, 45, 90. And you'll actually be reviewing your special right triangles with your pods. So those should be something familiar to you. Okay, so right at the beginning here, we're just going to practice with our calculator, make sure everybody knows how to work their calculator. I've got three problems here: cosine pi over 4, secant 0.75, and cotangent 2.73. You can probably find pretty quickly on your calculator your trig buttons, right? Sine, cosine, and tangent. Okay. So one thing that you'll have to pay attention to when you're asked to use a calculator and when you later get into solving problems is notice as you look at the angles that I have provided for you, those angles are in what units? Those are radians. So your calculator actually has two modes, a radian mode and a degree mode. You want to verify that you're in radian mode if I'm asking you to do the cosine of pi over 4 radians. So right next to your second button, you have that mode button. Go ahead and click that. If you're using the graphing calculator, its default is radians. So good to know if you ever reset your memory or go back to default settings, it'll go back to radians. So radians should be highlighted. If you have like a calculator that somebody else has used, sibling, it might be in degrees, so you might need to change it. If you have the smaller scientific calculators from Algebra 2, you have a button, I think it's DRG, and you just scroll over to whichever one you want, degrees or radians. Okay, so I'm in radian mode and I'm good to go. If you're simultaneously taking physics, there might be some times this semester where you have to be careful. We're working in radians, physics is doing degrees, so when you switch classes, you always want to check your mode. So be aware of that. Okay, to get out of that, you can just do second mode, and then you can type stuff in. So cosine pi over 4. You should have a pi button. My pi button is right above my divide sign, but I have to use my second button. And just verify that your calculator is working. You should get 0.707. Does anybody recall how you're going to do secant in your calculator? Okay, so looking at your sine, cosine, and tangent buttons, you might notice that there are sine with a -1, cosine to -1, and tangent to -1. Do those things represent cosecant, secant, and cotangent? David is saying no. Do you know what those things are? Those are the inverse functions. So that's inverse sine, inverse cosine, inverse tangent. You may have heard them referred to as arc sine, arc cosine, arc tangent. Inverses are not the same as cosecant, secant, and cotangent. Dylan is saying those things are reciprocals, and he's doing this flip sign, right? So one thing to note in order to be able to do these, if you want to do like a cosecant of theta, that's just 1 divided by the sine of theta. If you want to do the secant of theta, you're going to do 1 divided by cosine theta. It's reciprocal. And if you want to do a cotangent of theta, that's 1 over tangent theta. So you're going to use the definition of a reciprocal in order to be able to evaluate cosecant, secant, cotangent. So if we were doing secant of 0.75, I would do 1 over cosine 0.75 in my calculator. Okay, so good thing to note. Those inverses that David gave us, that name inverse is not the same thing as a reciprocal. Somebody give me, what's your decimal? Is it 1? 1.36. I think it rounds up to 7. Yeah. Okay, 1.367. And cotangent, 2.73. I think this one comes out to be a negative. You give 2. I can't remember the decimal. 2.9, and does it round up to 1 maybe? Yeah. Okay. So in order to do cotangent, we had to do 1 divided by tangent of 2.73. Okay. Now, this stuff that I have up here with the reciprocals, the only time you needed to use that in this particular chapter is if you're being asked to do stuff like this where you're using a calculator, you know the angle, you want to type it in, but you have a reciprocal function. We will see those things again in our next chapter, chapter 5. Those are called trig identities. And we'll be doing things like verifying, proving, simplifying, and we're going to make substitutions. Like if I see a cosecant of theta, I can change it. I could write it as 1 over sine theta. Okay? And then I can simplify from there. Okay. Any questions about the calculator? We will get to those inverse functions next week in 4-7. Okay, we're not there yet. Okay, the next part of your notes is what you're going to do together with your pods. So I have a half sheet that I'm going to be handing out to you. On the half sheet, there are 2 problems. Up at the top, it asks you to label the 3 sides, hypotenuse, opposite, adjacent, and then to do the 6 trig ratios. So you're thinking about SOHCAHTOA stuff right there. And then there's one example where you might know some things that you can label, and then you've got to find all the trig ratios. Okay, so work that out. On the bottom one, when you're working with numbers, you should have no decimal answers. Okay, so you really don't need a calculator for this. This would be a no calculator portion of quizzes and tests. No decimal answers. Answers should be in simplest form, so simplify all radicals, rationalize all denominators, reduce any fractions that can be reduced. Okay, so look out for those things. And then you can either do it on the back of the green sheet, or if you want to do it in your notebook, like if you're going to tape your green sheet down on all sides, you're going to draw out the 2 special right triangles and label their sides. So you should know something about the sides of special right triangles. When your group has all of this done, come check it with me, and then you can get started on your homework assignment. And there's tape dispensers out and about. So you can take this into your notebook if you want. Once your pod uses the tape dispenser, send it to another pod or ask around if you need one. Yeah, what's up? I suppose. Okay, come check with me when you get it done.